In Red Hollow, Texas, October 1981, the silence wasn't a blessing. It was a predator. Earl Whitaker, a Vietnam veteran who thought he'd seen true fear, buried the monstrous beast under a blood moon, convinced he'd saved his farm. He was wrong. Because in Red Hollow, silence isn't peace. It's a suffocating hush that vibrates with ancient hunger. Whispers slither from the cornfields, colder than the October wind, carrying not just his name, but a chilling promise. He didn't just kill a monster. He woke the very soul of the land. Now, Red Hollow demands a debt, a reckoning paid in blood and fear. Can one man survive when the ground itself turns hostile? Or will he become part of the very terror he tried to bury? Brace yourself. The Hollow has woken, and it's coming for you. Red Hollow County, Texas, usually slept soundly under the vast, indifferent gaze of the Lone Star moon. Miles of sprawling farms, barbed wire fences humming a low, almost inaudible tune in the wind. Red barns stoic against the elements, and fields of golden wheat that swayed like a restless, whispered secret. But on that October dawn in 1981, the silence wasn't just heavy. It was a smothering blanket thick with unspoken things. Earl Whitaker, a man etched with the lines of 64 years and the unshakable calm of a Vietnam veteran, was awake before the first crow of a rooster, a habit ingrained deeper than any morning ritual. 10 years had passed since he'd buried Sarah, his wife, leaving him alone on the 50 acres inherited from his daddy, a weathered Ford pickup and a wooden ranch house with a porch that stared out across the fields like a sentinel. The house creaked, not with age, but with a kind of watchful patience. He poured black coffee so strong it could wake the dead, and spread thick butter on a slice of cornbread. He ate slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on the window. The full moon, swollen and impossibly bright, hung low over the horizon, bathing the land in a ghostly silver light that stretched shadows into grotesque shapes. It was beautiful, but today it felt predatory. Slung over his shoulder was his old Winchester 12-gauge, its wood worn smooth by decades of handling. Clipped to his leather holster just above his hip was the .357 Magnum, a gift from a grunt he'd saved in Phuoc Tuy province. Earl was a man who believed in being ready. Living out here, far from the nearest neighbor, far from the county line, meant being prepared for coyotes, for two-bit thieves, or for anything else the darkness might cough up. The unease had been simmering in the community for months, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of everyday life. Chickens vanishing without a trace, calves found savagely torn apart in the pre-dawn mist, and then the whispers. A local kid, Billy Jenkins, swore on his grandma's Bible he'd seen a dog the size of a man loping through the cornfield near his place. The sheriff, old Hank Peterson, just chuckled, muttering about wild dogs and the overactive imagination of country boys. But Earl knew the smell of danger. It wasn't a scent you forgot, not after the jungle. This was different, though. This wasn't the smell of gunpowder or fear sweat. This was older, fouler. He stepped onto the porch. The night air was cold, damp, clinging to his skin like a second shadow. The wind, when it stirred, brought the rustle of the wheat fields, a sound that usually soothed him. Tonight, it sounded like 1,000 secrets being whispered, and with it, a new smell. Metallic, sweet, like stale blood and something else. Something fetid, vaguely reminiscent of rotten meat. He stopped, eyes narrowed, listening. No crickets chirping, no frogs croaking from the creek bed, no owls hooting from the ancient oak by the barn. Just that unnatural, all-consuming silence. A silence that pressed in, thick and suffocating. Then, he heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps thudding on the damp earth, not hooves, not paws. Something with a purposeful gait, too slow for a fleeing animal, too heavy for a man. The sound came from the edge of his property, where his wheat fields met the dense, untamed thicket of the woods. Earl's hand instinctively tightened on the Winchester. His breath hitched, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Then came the growl, a sound so deep it vibrated through the ground, vibrating through his bones, making the hair on his arms prickle to attention. It wasn't an animal growl. It was a promise, a threat. From the deepest shadows of the cornfield, two yellow eyes flared to life, like distant malevolent headlamps. They blinked once, slowly, then fixed on him. The creature stepped out into the stark moonlight. Nearly 7 feet tall, its body was a mass of dark, matted fur, thick muscles bunched under the skin. Its mouth hung open, revealing long, curved fangs that dripped strings of glistening saliva onto the parched earth. It was a werewolf, or what the old-timers in the county, their voices hushed, called a skinwalker. Earl didn't freeze. The 20 years of war snapped back into place. His mind, usually a slow, deliberate machine in the quiet of his farm, became a lightning-fast calculus of angles and threats. He gripped the Winchester tighter, taking a deliberate step back, the barrel unwavering, pointed at the creature's chest. "You picked the wrong damn farm, friend," he murmured, his voice a low rasp that surprised even himself. It was a challenge, a declaration of war. The monster didn't respond with a growl. It launched itself forward in a single, blurring leap, a dark, heavy projectile. The impact slammed Earl to the ground, knocking the air from his lungs. The Winchester flew from his grasp, skittering across the packed earth, landing with a dull thud somewhere in the darkness. The creature's hot, nauseating breath assaulted his nostrils, a mix of musk, blood, and something profoundly, chillingly rotten. Its claws, long and razor-sharp, raked across his leather jacket sleeve, tearing through the tough hide as easily as paper, leaving angry red welts on his forearm. But Earl Whitaker had more than 20 years of trained reflexes, honed in 1,000 desperate moments. His free hand, moving with the practiced grace of a man who'd seen too much, found the cold steel of his .357 Magnum. He drew it, leveled it at the dark mass above him, and fired twice. The shots cracked through the suffocating silence, deafening. In their suddenness, the creature shrieked, a sound that echoed across the fields, a sound that wasn't just animal. There was something undeniably human in that raw, agonized howl, a pitch of suffering that made Earl's blood run cold. Even wounded, the skinwalker clawed forward again, its yellow eyes burning with renewed fury. Earl, still sprawled on the ground, his vision blurring from the impact, thumbed the hammer back on the .357. He aimed not for the body this time, but for the head. He squeezed the trigger. The third shot was a dry, definitive crack. The creature went limp, its massive body falling heavily onto the damp earth, kicking up a cloud of dust and spraying dark, viscous blood onto the trampled wheat. It lay still. Horribly, terribly still. Earl pushed the dead weight off him, gasping, his chest burning. He scrambled to his feet, tasting copper in his mouth. He stood over the motionless creature, bathed in the moon's eerie glow. Its paws were enormous, with claws like sharpened bone, but its fingers were disturbing. Too long, too articulated, almost like deformed human hands. The face was a grotesque mockery, a feral snout twisting into something almost recognizable. And those eyes. One was still wide open, yellow and vacant, but the other, the one he'd shot through, still seemed to glare at him with an enduring, primal hatred. It stared, and Earl felt with a profound, terrifying certainty that it had truly seen him. No one in Red Hollow would believe him. Not a soul. He looked around, the silence now ringing in his ears. No one would understand. They would call him crazy, senile, a man haunted by old wars. He knew what he had to do. With a groan, Earl grabbed the creature's mangled leg, its fur rough and stiff with cooling blood. He gritted his teeth, pulling, dragging the immense weight across the field, the furrows of disturbed earth marking its passage. He pulled it all the way to a shallow ditch at the back of his property, near the densest part of the woods. It took him nearly an hour, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning. He kicked dirt and dead leaves over the monstrous form, burying it shallowly, marking the spot only in his memory. A grim secret buried deep in the heart of Red Hollow. He hoped it was deep enough. As the first faint streaks of orange and pink bled into the eastern sky, Announcing the false promise of dawn, Earl Whitaker was back in his kitchen, pouring another cup of coffee. As if nothing had happened. As if the night hadn't tried to swallow him whole. The weeks that followed the moonlit horror stretched out, deceptively mundane. Red Hollow, true to Sheriff Peterson's placid assurances, seemed to fall back into its familiar rhythm. The livestock attacks ceased. The whispers of a dog the size of a man faded from the general store's gossip. Children played in yards again, their laughter echoing a normal, wholesome sound. For anyone else, it would have been a return to peace, a confirmation that Earl's story had indeed been the ravings of an old man with too much imagination and too strong a memory of war. But Earl knew better. The peace wasn't real. It was too quiet. He'd tried briefly to explain it again. Down at Ma's diner over his usual coffee refill, he'd mentioned to Mrs. Albright, whose prize-winning hen had vanished last month, that the culprit was taken care of. She'd smiled thinly, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "Well, Earl, bless your heart, you always were one for tall tales. Glad Bessie's safe now anyway." Her eyes, though, held a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Pity, perhaps, or a deep, resigned weariness. Sheriff Peterson, still dismissive, had slapped Earl on the back, a little too hard. "You keep that property secure, Earl. Don't want any more wild dogs stirring up trouble." He chuckled, but his gaze didn't quite meet Earl's. It was a practiced deflection, a common tactic for small-town lawmen dealing with things they couldn't or wouldn't understand. The more Earl pressed, the more isolated he felt. They weren't just disbelieving him. They were choosing not to believe, erecting a wall of comfortable denial that made the truth an unwelcome intrusion. And the truth was, the silence was worse than any snarl. Before the incident, his farm, though isolated, had never been truly quiet. The wind always carried a symphony of sounds. The rustle of leaves, the distant lowing of cattle, the chirping of crickets at dusk, the lonely hoot of an owl, the buzz of cicadas in the heat of the day. Now, nothing, or almost nothing. It was a muted world, like someone had turned down the volume knob on the universe, leaving only the faintest, most unsettling hum. The wheat fields, though still swaying, seemed to do so without their usual whisper, a silent, rhythmic dance under a sky that felt too vast, too empty. Earl started walking his property every evening just before sundown. He called it checking the fences, but it was more. It was a patrol, a vigil. His senses, honed by years of instinct, were on high alert. He noticed things, subtle things, things that to anyone else would be dismissed as coincidence, or the natural decay of an old farm. One afternoon, a few days after burying the creature, he found a long, sturdy branch, freshly broken, lying across his main fence line. It was too thick for the wind to snap, too high for any animal to have pulled down accidentally. It looked almost placed, deliberately. He picked it up, feeling the fresh tear of the wood, the dampness of the bark. It sent a shiver down his spine. He tossed it aside, trying to rationalize it, but the image of those yellow eyes and that chilling growl kept bleeding into his thoughts. Then there was the smell. A faint, almost imperceptible scent that would drift on the wind, particularly around dusk, when the shadows grew long and hungry. It wasn't the overpowering stench of decay he'd encountered that night. This was subtler, more elusive, metallic, like old blood mixed with something earthy and damp, but also with a strange, almost acrid undertone, like ozone after a lightning strike. He'd sniff the air, turning his head, trying to pinpoint its source, but it would vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving him alone with the too quiet hum of the fields. His cattle, usually placid, seemed agitated. They bunched together at night, huddled near the barn, their eyes wide and nervous, staring out into the darkness of the cornfields. Sometimes he'd catch them letting out low, mournful moans, not the usual sounds of discontent, but something deeper, more akin to fear. He'd check them, look for signs of illness, but they were fine. Physically, it was as if they felt the same unnatural silence, the same unseen weight pressing down on the land. The worst part was the barn. An old, cavernous structure, its beams groaning like an ancient ship. It held his tractor, farming tools, and the bulk of his hay. One evening, as he went to stack a fresh bale, he caught a glint of something in the deepest, darkest corner. A fleeting flash, too bright for moonlight, too sharp for a reflection. He turned, his old eyes straining, but it was gone. He walked towards the spot, his hand already reaching for the .357 tucked into his belt. Nothing, just dust motes dancing in the fading light. He swept the area with his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating nothing but cobwebs and old tools. Yet the feeling of something being there, something watching him, lingered, cold and heavy in the air. He left the barn, door latched that night, and double-checked the padlock. He kept the strange, smooth stone he'd found by the burial site in his pocket. It was a dark, almost black stone, cool to the touch, and strangely heavy for its size. Carved into its surface was a symbol, crudely etched but distinct. Two overlapping triangles, one upright, one inverted, bisected by a jagged line. It wasn't a symbol he recognized from any local lore, no cattle brand, no religious emblem. It felt ancient and wrong. He'd tried to wash the dirt from it, but the faint metallic scent clung to its surface, the same scent he sometimes caught on the wind. It was a tangible piece of the unnatural, a cold, hard fact amidst a sea of unsettling feelings. He found himself rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger, a nervous habit, the strange weight a constant reminder. This peace, this unnatural calm, was a constant gnawing unease. It wasn't the tranquility he remembered. It was the quiet before a scream, the breath held before a plunge. He walked the land, rifle slung, eyes scanning the cornfields, his ears strained for any sound that wasn't the wind. But the wind, too, seemed to have learned silence. It rustled the wheat, but without its usual playful whistle. The leaves on the trees shivered, but without a whisper. Red Hollow was holding its breath, and Earl was certain it wasn't holding. It alone. He felt it in his gut, a cold, hard certainty. Whatever he had tangled with, it wasn't gone. It was merely listening, waiting. And the unsettling quiet felt like the soft, purring rumble of a predator just before it strikes. He knew it. The only question was, when would it spring? The footprint in the mud beside the disturbed trap wasn't just a mark. It was a declaration. Too large for a coyote, too precise for a badger. It was undeniably, terrifyingly clawed, and it pointed with an almost deliberate malevolence directly towards Earl's back door. It was no longer a question of what was out there. It was a question of how close it had gotten, how bold. The cold, smooth stone in his pocket, with its strange etched symbol, suddenly felt like a burning ember, a tangible connection to the darkness that was now undeniably breathing down his neck. The deceptive calm of Red Hollow began to fray, for Earl at least. He started seeing them, or thinking he did. Fleeting shadows, quick as thought, dancing at the edges of his vision. In the golden light of dusk, a flicker in the deepest part of the cornfield, a movement too fluid, too swift for the wind-tossed stalks. He'd stop, his heart thumping a heavy, irregular beat, and stare, his hands instinctively reaching for the Winchester. But there was never anything there, only the oppressive, unnatural silence that now seemed to hum with an almost vibrating tension. The whispers began. Faint at first, carried on the wind that rustled through the wheat. Not human voices, not exactly. More like a dry, papery hiss, like 1,000 insects rubbing their legs together in unison. It would build, almost imperceptibly, a low, sibilant murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He'd walk into the fields, rifle ready, trying to pinpoint the source, and it would vanish, leaving him standing alone in the vast, unnerving quiet. Then one evening, as he was, closing up the barn, a sound distinct from the hiss cut through the air. His name, Earl. Low, drawn out, ragged as if ripped from a throat unused to human speech. It wasn't a growl, not precisely. It was a mimicry, chilling in its imperfection. He whirled, shotgun leveled, but the barn was empty save for the uneasy cattle huddled in the far corner, their breath pluming in the cold air. The subtle violations intensified, escalating from unsettling to outright terror. One morning he found a child's rag doll, missing an eye, clutched in the barbed wire fence at the very edge of his property, miles from the nearest road. It was old, faded, but undeniably a child's toy. No child lived within 5 miles of his ranch. Who would leave it there, and why? He burned it that evening, the doll's stuffing smelling like old dust and something else he couldn't name, a lingering scent of decay that pricked at the back of his throat. Days later, a tattered piece of cloth, dark and coarse, appeared hanging. From the lowest branch of the ancient oak by his creek, a tree he'd known since he was a boy. It fluttered in the phantom wind, a dark flag of unsettling defiance. He approached it cautiously, his hand on the .357. It looked like a piece of an old blanket, but as he got closer, he saw a faint dark stain on it, dried, crusted. He didn't need to touch it to know what it was. Blood. His stomach churned. This wasn't just random mischief. This was a message. His livestock, once merely agitated, were now on the brink of panic. The cattle refused to graze. Beyond the immediate vicinity of the barn, their eyes rolling in their heads, their low moans a constant lament. The horses, usually so spirited, trembled whenever the wind picked up, their ears swiveling nervously towards the cornfields. Then, one crisp morning, Earl found another calf, dead. But this wasn't like the previous attacks. The calf wasn't torn apart, no feast devoured by a hungry predator. It lay on its side, strangely pristine save for one detail. A single clean incision, impossibly precise, ran from its throat to its belly. The wound was deep, but almost surgical in its neatness. And its blood, though congealed, was not scattered. It seemed to have been drained, a cold, meticulous act, not one of savage hunger. This was not a beast hunting for food. This was something else, something far more deliberate. He tried the sheriff again, drove the dead calf into town in the bed of his pickup, its limp body covered with a tarp. Sheriff Peterson, leaning back in his creaky chair, feet propped on his desk, listened with a forced patience that bordered on condescension. He squinted at the calf, poked it with a stick. "Earl," he sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. "This here looks like a coyote, maybe. Bobcat, clean kill, sure, but nature, Earl. It ain't always pretty. A coyote don't make a cut like that, Hank. That's a scalpel cut, or something like it." Earl's voice was tight, strained. He felt the anger rising, hot and impotent. Peterson just laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "Earl, you're letting your imagination run wild. Been out here alone too long, maybe. Seeing monsters where there's just hungry critters. Maybe you ought to think about getting some help on the farm. A hired hand. Someone to talk to besides those cows." The thinly veiled insult hung in the air. Earl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning. It wasn't just dismissal anymore. It was outright avoidance, a refusal to engage with a reality that threatened the comfortable order of their lives. And maybe a hint of suspicion. Was Earl Whitaker losing his mind? The sheriff's eyes, normally benign, held a flicker of something new. Pity mixed with a growing weariness, as if Earl was becoming a problem to be managed, not a man to be believed. He left the sheriff's office, the dead calf still in his truck bed, feeling more isolated than ever. Red Hollow wasn't just quiet. It was deaf. It wasn't just peaceful. It was oblivious. Or worse, willfully blind. The terror was no longer just the beast. It was the suffocating solitude of his fight. He knew with a grim certainty that whatever was happening, he was facing it alone. His ranch, his haven, was slowly becoming a cage, and the bars were made of fear and denial. That evening, as the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, Earl stood on his porch. He heard the faint, unsettling rustle in the cornfield, closer now, a sound like a whispered promise. He saw the fleeting shadows, no longer just at the edge of his vision, but deeper, darker, more defined. And then he smelled it, that acrid metallic stench, strong and immediate like fresh blood on hot metal. He turned, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hand on the grip of his .357. And there it was, not a shadow, not a whisper. Right. There, in the soft, freshly turned earth of his flower bed directly beneath his bedroom window, a single, clear imprint. It was large, impossibly so, dwarfing his own boot print nearby. Its shape was disturbingly articulate, not just a paw, but almost a hand with 5 distinct clawed digits. It was the same footprint he'd found by the trap, but now, it was here, too close. A silent, chilling message pressed into the soil. His home was no longer a sanctuary. It was being watched. And the watcher was inside the walls of his life. The footprint. It wasn't just an imprint in the soil. It was a cold, stark brand burned into Earl's mind. It was a direct violation, not of his property, but of his very sanity. It wasn't just a sign that something was out there. It was a mocking taunt, a bold statement that it knew exactly where he slept. His home, the last bastion of his solitude, had been breached, not by force, but by a silent, insidious terror. He'd spent the rest of that night with the Winchester, across his lap, sitting in his armchair, staring out the darkened window. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind, every distant phantom sound of the cattle shifted his gaze, strained his ears. He was a sentinel in his own prison. By dawn, the exhaustion was bone deep, but his mind raced with a frantic energy. The sheriff was useless. The town was blind. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. But Earl Whitaker wasn't a man to surrender. If no one would help him, he would help himself. He couldn't fight what he didn't understand. This wasn't just a beast anymore. It was something cunning, something that played games, something that left messages. He needed answers that a shotgun couldn't provide. He needed to know why. His thoughts turned to the forgotten corners of Red Hollow's past. Old Man Hemlock had once mentioned, in a drunken stupor, that the county had a dark streak. The town's founder, Elias Thorne, was rumored to have had a strange connection to the land, an almost mystical understanding of its ancient ways. Perhaps the answers weren't in bullets, but in history. The Red Hollow County Library was a relic, a small brick building tucked between the church and the general store. It smelled of old paper, dust, and a faint, lingering scent of lemon polish. Inside, Mrs. Gable, a stern woman with spectacles perched on her nose, looked up from her knitting as Earl walked in. She raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised to see him. Earl Whitaker wasn't known for his literary pursuits. "Morning, Earl," she said, her voice flat. "Something I can help you with?" "Morning, Clara. Just looking for some local history. Old newspapers, maybe some of those county records." He tried to sound casual, but his voice was too tight, too strained. Mrs. Gable gave him a quizzical look. "History, you say? Well, most of that's back. The archives. You know, dusty and mostly forgotten." She gestured vaguely towards a narrow hallway leading to the back. The archive room was a tomb of forgotten tales. Rows of tall metal shelves groaned under the weight of bound newspapers, ledgers, and boxes filled with brittle documents. Dust motes danced in the sliver of sunlight that pierced the grimy window. Earl coughed, the smell of decaying paper filling his lungs. He started methodically pulling down thick, yellowed volumes of the Red Hollow Gazette from the late 1800s and early 1900s. He hunched over a rickety table, his fingers tracing faded headlines. For hours, he sifted through mundane reports of harvests, town council meetings, and local scandals. But then, he started finding them, fragmented, dismissed accounts that made the hair on his neck stand on end. Lost cattle, unexplained. Disappearance near Thorne Homestead, from 1903. The article spoke of several prized livestock vanishing overnight, with strange tracks found that defied identification. Sheriff at the time blamed wolves, a convenient explanation. Panic in Hollow Creek, local boy recovers from fright, 1917. A short piece describing a young boy found wandering incoherent deep in the woods, claiming he'd been chased by a man-dog with glowing eyes. The doctor attributed it to a fever dream. Strange happenings on the Miller farm, 1932. A family reported odd noises, shadows, and a pervasive sense of being watched, eventually abandoning their farm due to unspecified disturbances. The paper chalked it up to financial woes. They were all there, scattered through the decades, brief mentions of things unexplained, things that were quickly dismissed, rationalized away. Wild dogs, overactive imaginations, local legends, hollow tales. The very phrases Sheriff Peterson used today. It was a pattern, a consistent denial of something dark lurking beneath the surface of this quiet community. A collective refusal to see. He pushed away a particularly thick ledger, sighing. Was this all there was? Just echoes of his own experience, twisted into mundane explanations. His hand brushed against something hidden behind a stack of old plat maps, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a book, not a ledger, not a newspaper, a journal. It was bound in dark, worn leather, its cover smooth and cool under his fingers. No title, no author. It looked old, incredibly old. The leather cracked and faded, but surprisingly well preserved, as if it had been carefully hidden. He opened it, the pages rustling like dry leaves. The handwriting was meticulous, looping script that filled the pages in faded ink. The first entry was dated October 14th, 1905. He squinted at the first line. The land sighs tonight. A new moon and an old fear stirred. His breath caught. This wasn't a newspaper, this was a personal account. And as he read, a cold dread began to coil in his gut. The journal belonged to one Thomas Thorne, a direct descendant of Elias, and, chillingly, the man who had owned Earl's very own 50 acres, a generation before Earl's father acquired it. Thorne's entries spoke of the land, not as property, but as a living entity, ancient and unforgiving. He spoke of the curse of the hollow, of things that walked between worlds, of shapeshifters that were neither man nor beast. He called them the Watchers, and sometimes simply the Hungry Ones. Thorne's writings detailed a deep, almost reverent fear of these creatures. He described rituals, strange symbols, and offerings made to appease the hollow's darkness. He wrote of the importance of not disturbing certain ancient places on the land, of leaving things undisturbed, lest the slumbering spirits be awoken. The entries grew increasingly frantic and paranoid, detailing protective measures Earl had never heard of. Salt lines, iron charms, specific herbs burned at crossroads. Thorne seemed obsessed, his life consumed by the fear of what lurked just beyond the veil of normalcy. They take the weakest first. An entry from 1910 read, "The lost lambs, the sick calves, but they hunger for more, for the soul of the land, and for the unsuspecting." Another entry, later, was almost illegible. The ink smeared as if the writer's hand had trembled. "I saw it again tonight, not in the woods, but in the eyes of old man Hemlock's dog. It wears their skin, but the eyes are wrong. They are not his." Earl felt a prickle of unease. Hemlock. Sheriff Peterson. Those dismissive smiles. Were they just blind or something more? The journal concluded abruptly in 1912, a final chilling entry. "The binding is broken. I disturbed it. Fool that I was. It has found me. The ritual was incomplete. There is a way to stop it, to push it back into the earth, but it requires a sacrifice, a true one, and the symbol must be carved. It must be seen." The last few words were scrawled, barely legible. "The hollow demands its debt." There was no more. Thomas Thorne had simply ceased to write. Earl knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Thorne had vanished, one of those unexplained disappearances the old papers mentioned. He flipped back through the pages, searching for the symbol Thorne had mentioned. And there it was, sketched crudely but clearly on a torn page. Two overlapping triangles, one upright, one inverted, bisected by a jagged line. It was the same symbol he'd seen before, the one carved into the strange, smooth stone he still carried in his pocket, the stone he'd found near the burial site. And then the horrifying truth crashed down on him, stealing his breath. The symbol. He hadn't just seen it on the stone. He'd seen it near the burial site itself, not etched into the earth before he'd buried the creature, but after. In the churned soil, just where the beast had fallen, crudely scratched, fresh, as if drawn by a claw or a finger. It hadn't been there when he'd first surveyed the gruesome scene. It had appeared later. He had killed the creature. And in doing so, he hadn't ended the threat. He had activated something. He had completed some twisted, ancient ritual. He hadn't just stirred the hollow's darkness. He had unleashed it. The peace, the terrible silence, wasn't a sign of victory. It was the calm of a predator, no longer disturbed, but now awakened, fully aware and coming for its due. And Earl Whitaker had unwittingly signed the hollow's name to the contract. The worn leather journal felt like a burning coal in Earl's hands as he walked out of the library, the late afternoon sun a mocking golden lie. The truth, raw and cold, had finally revealed itself, peeling back the comforting layers of denial. He hadn't just put down a rabid beast. He had, with 3 desperate shots, fulfilled a horrifying prophecy, twisted an ancient ward, and stirred something that had slept beneath Red Hollow for generations. The symbol, the same symbol etched on the stone in his pocket, the same one scratched into the journal, was now confirmed to be a mark of something far more sinister than a simple monster hunt. And it was waiting for him. He didn't go home first. He couldn't. His ranch, once a sanctuary, now felt like the very epicenter of the rising dread. He drove, not towards his familiar fields, but in a wide, circuitous route that would bring him to the farthest, most isolated corner of his property, the part that bordered the densest section of the woods, where he'd dragged the body. The air grew colder the deeper he drove down the winding, unpaved road that led to the back of his land. Even though the sun was still high, the trees seemed to close in, their shadows lengthening, morphing into indistinct shapes that watched him from the periphery. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence that now felt less like an absence of sound, and more like a heavy, suffocating presence. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made him jump. The old Winchester was loaded, and across his lap, his 3.57 Magnum heavy in its holster. But he knew, with a sickening certainty, that firepower alone wouldn't be enough this time. He was walking into something far older than bullets, older than fear. He was walking into a story that had begun long before him. He parked the Ford behind a thick stand of pines, far enough from the fence line to be unseen from the road. He grabbed a shovel from the truck bed. The forest floor was damp, smelling of rich earth and decaying leaves. This part of the woods was always darker, cooler, the trees so thick their branches intertwined like gnarled fingers, blocking out most of the sky. The familiar path he'd forged dragging the creature was still visible, a faint line of disturbed earth leading into the deeper gloom. As he got closer, a different smell permeated the air, sharper than the metallic scent he'd caught on the wind at his porch. This was undeniably, powerfully the smell of fresh blood, mixed with the cloying sweetness of rot. His stomach clenched. He pushed through a curtain of low-hanging branches, and then he saw it, the unmarked grave. It was disturbed, not dug up, not completely, but the earth was churned, as if something had thrashed violently beneath the surface, or struggled to escape. The covering of leaves and loose dirt he'd piled on was scattered, revealing patches of dark, wet soil beneath, and clinging to the upturned leaves, seeping into the damp ground, was a viscous, deep crimson. Fresh blood, not dried and caked, like the creature's own. This was new. Whose blood? What had happened here? A cold wave of dread washed over him. Had something else come for it? Or had it tried to get out? He gripped the shovel, his knuckles white. The ominous growl he'd heard in his mind from the journal's final entry now seemed to echo in the very air around him. Taking a deep, ragged breath, Earl began to dig. The shovel bit into the soft, disturbed earth, revealing the dark soil beneath. Each scrape of metal against dirt sent a jolt of anxiety through him. He dug faster, frantic, needing to see, needing to understand. After a few frantic minutes, the shovel hit something solid. He cleared away more earth, and a dark, matted expanse of fur emerged. The creature. It was still there, but it wasn't as he'd left it. What lay beneath the earth was a grotesque spectacle. The body was in an advanced state of decay, a putrid horror, flesh rotting, fur sloughing off in clumps. But amidst the decay there were new, horrifying details. Its teeth, already long and predatory, seemed to have elongated further, piercing through what remained of its gums, glistening with a fresh, sickening sheen. Its claws, too, had extended sharp and black like obsidian blades. And then, the worst of it, small, pulsating growths, like dark, engorged boils, pulsed faintly on its exposed skin, particularly around its neck and torso. They seemed to swell and recede, as if something within them was still alive, feeding. A wave of nausea washed over Earl. This wasn't just decomposition. This was something else entirely. A mutation, a continuation. And then he saw it, carved deeply, brutally into the creature's chest, where its fur had rotted away to reveal raw, decaying flesh, was the symbol. The overlapping triangles bisected by the jagged line. It wasn't crudely scratched as he'd seen it in the soil. Here it was precise, almost ritualistic, cut into the monster's very being. It was the same symbol from the journal, the same symbol on the stone in his pocket. It had been carved here on the creature's chest, a mark of ownership, a brand of its true purpose. This wasn't just a beast he had killed. It was a conduit, a vessel, a sacrifice perhaps, or a warning. Earl stumbled back, nearly tripping over. His own feet, the shovel falling from his hand with a dull clatter. His mind reeled. The journal's words screamed in his head. The binding is broken, I disturbed it, fool that I was. He had broken the binding. He had disturbed it. He hadn't just killed a monster. He had, in his desperate act of self-preservation, unleashed something ancient and terrible. The piece of red hollow had been a fragile spell, maintained by the very presence of this creature, whatever its purpose was. And now, that spell was shattered. The creature's single, still-open yellow eye, glassy with decay, seemed to stare up at him from the makeshift grave, no longer with hatred, but with a chilling, knowing triumph. Just then, from the deepest shadows of the dense woods closer than it should have been came a sound, not a snarl, not a howl. It was a distant, low growl, deeper and more resonant than any sound Earl had ever heard. It vibrated through the earth, through the soles of his boots, up his spine, straight into the bone. It was so low, so guttural, that it felt less like a sound and more like a pressure, a force. It was a sound of ancient, simmering rage. And then, impossibly, it shifted. The growl deepened, taking on a strange, almost resonant quality, like heavy stones grinding together. It wasn't just an animal sound anymore. It was a voice, and it seemed to be saying his name. Whitaker. It was a whisper, drawn out, ragged, yet impossibly loud in the oppressive silence of the woods. Earl froze, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't a mimicry this time. It was a direct, chilling address. He was no longer alone in these woods, and whatever had just spoken, it wasn't the creature he'd buried. This was something far older, far more patient, and far, far angrier. The piece of red hollow was a cruel joke. The game had just begun, and Earl Whitaker was its designated player. The low, guttural whisper of his name, ripped from the very fabric of the woods, had chased Earl out of that cursed patch of earth like a phantom. He didn't run, not exactly, but his retreat was swift, propelled by a cold, primal terror that settled deep in his bones. He scrambled back to his truck, heart hammering against his ribs, every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sounding like a heavy footfall behind him. He didn't dare look back. He just knew. It was there, and it was watching. He drove like a madman, the old Ford bouncing over the rutted track, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. When he finally reached his ranch, the setting sun cast long, hungry shadows across his fields, transforming the familiar landscape into a canvas of dread. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very air pulsed with unseen eyes. The first thing he did was fortify, not just with locks, but with every piece of scrap metal, every heavy timber he could find. He boarded up windows, secured the barn doors with chains, and even moved a heavy wooden workbench against his bedroom door. It was a futile gesture, he knew, against something that could appear and disappear, something that could carve symbols into flesh. But it was a desperate human need to feel some semblance of control. The Winchester lay on his kitchen table, the .357 on his nightstand, both loaded. He felt a deep, gnawing fatigue, but sleep was a distant luxury. He was a man under siege. The taunting began subtly, like a cat toying with a mouse. The next morning, as he walked out to check on his cattle, he saw it. His Ford pickup, usually parked neatly by the barn, sat with its front tires deflated, slashed beyond repair. Not just punctured, deep, violent gashes, as if torn by immense claws. A wave of impotent rage washed over him. His lifeline to town, to any potential help, was severed. He was marooned. He kicked at the flattened rubber, the metallic tang of ozone from the slashes pricking his nostrils. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a message. You're not going anywhere. He spent the better part of the day trying to patch the tires, a futile effort. He would need new ones, and that meant a long, weary walk into town, leaving his property vulnerable. He was still fuming when the lights flickered and died. A total blackout. He cursed, grabbed a flashlight, and went out to check. The power lines. He found the cut near the main road where the lines ran from the pole to his house. Not snapped by a storm, cleanly, meticulously cut. The insulation stripped away, the copper wires severed as if by something impossibly sharp. It was a surgical precision that chilled him more than any brute force. The night was already settling, and now it was absolute darkness, broken only by the thin beam of his flashlight and the vast, indifferent glow of the moon. This was not about light. It was about isolation, about plunging him into a world where every shadow could hide a horror. He felt the cold touch of a truly intelligent enemy. Then came the fires. Small at first, a patch of dried weeds near the fence line smoldering faintly at dusk, quickly doused by Earl with a bucket of water. He dismissed it as spontaneous combustion, or perhaps a rogue ember from his own chimney. But then, a few nights later, a larger blaze erupted at the far edge of his cornfield, a terrifying orange lick against the dark sky. He fought it alone, beating at the flames with a blanket, his lungs burning from the smoke, his eyes stinging from the heat. It was strategically placed far from the barn, far from the house, but close enough to send a clear message. We can reach you anywhere. We can take everything. The smell of burnt wheat, acrid and bitter, filled the air for days, a constant reminder of the encroaching threat. The psychological warfare intensified. The faint whispers in the fields became clearer, more defined. Sometimes they seemed to mimic the sounds of his own farm, a cow's low moo, the creak of the porch swing, the distant chug of his old tractor, only twisted, distorted, wrong. And then his name, more often now. Earl. Come out. Earl. It wasn't a growl anymore. It was a chilling parody of human speech, ragged and raspy, as if forced through a throat not meant for words. It came from the cornfields, from the woods, sometimes from behind the barn. He would spin around, Winchester ready, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, but there was never a discernible source. Just the unnatural silence that would descend once the mimicry ceased. A silence that felt heavier now, pregnant with unseen presence. He tried to call for help. He tried his phone, dead. He picked up the receiver, nothing but a flat, empty drone. He tried it again, later, from a payphone in town, after a long, exhausting walk. This time it rang, but Sheriff Peterson's line was always busy, or he was out on a call. Each attempt felt like hitting a wall of cotton, soft, yielding, yet utterly impenetrable. He even tried calling his cousin in Abilene, a grizzled old rancher named Walt, but the line to Abilene also seemed to be perpetually dead, or connecting to a rapid, frustrating, busy signal. It wasn't just the county. It felt like the entire world was conspiring to keep him isolated, trapped. Red Hollow was indeed closing in around him, its invisible walls growing higher, thicker. Earl felt the paranoia tightening its grip. Every shadow was a lurking threat, every sound a deliberate taunt. He caught himself talking to himself, muttering strategies, reassurances. He slept little, grabbing an hour or two in his armchair, shotgun across his lap, waking at every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind. His face grew gaunt, his eyes hollowed, bloodshot. He moved with a constant hyper-alert tension, his hand never far from his weapon. But beneath the fear, a new kind of resolve was hardening. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a battle for his home, for his sanity, for the very soul of Red Hollow. He wouldn't let them have it, not without a fight. One night the air grew particularly cold, even for October. A thin skeletal moon hung in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows. Earl was in his bedroom, Winchester propped by the window, peering out into the inky blackness. He'd heard the faint, almost rhythmic scraping sound coming from the outside wall, just beneath his window. For the last 10 minutes, a slow, deliberate drag, followed by a lighter scratch. He knew what it was. He just didn't want to believe. He waited, heart pounding for the sound to stop, for the creature to move on. But it didn't. It seemed to linger, a chilling persistence. Finally, unable to bear the suspense, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, moving silently, his .357 drawn. The cold seeped into his bones, but his mind was sharp, focused. He rounded the corner of the house, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the ground. And there it was. Not a shadow, not a sound. A single, fresh wolf's paw print, impossibly clear, pressed into the soft, damp earth just beneath his bedroom window. It was massive, far larger than any wolf Earl had ever seen, its claws clearly defined, digging into the soil. It was impossibly close. It wasn't a taunt anymore. It was a direct, chilling message. His home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a hunting ground. And Earl Whitaker was the prey. The wolf's paw print beneath his bedroom window was the final, terrifying punctuation mark. It was a declaration of war, a silent, chilling promise that the game was over, and the true hunt had begun. Earl spent the rest of that night like a cornered animal, moving through his house, checking every lock, peering through every boarded-up window. Sleep was an impossible luxury, haunted by the image of that print, so impossibly close. The air in Red Hollow itself felt thinner, charged with an unspoken tension, like the calm before a devastating tornado. The ancient journal lay open on his kitchen table, its brittle pages filled with Thomas Thorne's frantic warnings. Earl reread them, tracing the faded ink with a trembling finger. The binding is broken, a true sacrifice. The Hollow demands its debt. He had become the catalyst. His attempt to defend his home had, ironically, shattered the fragile shield that had kept Red Hollow safe for generations. The creature he'd killed wasn't just a monster. It was a lesser guardian, a sentinel, or perhaps even a part of a larger slumbering evil. And its death, not its life, had unleashed the true horror. The signs now were undeniable, even for the willfully blind townsfolk. News, slow to travel in Red Hollow, began to filter in, carried on the hushed whispers of worried neighbors. Mrs. Albright's entire flock of chickens vanished overnight. Not a feather left behind. Old Man Hemlock found his prize heifer disemboweled in the dead center of his pasture, its body left in a grotesque display, mirroring the clean, precise wound Earl had found on his own calf. There was a string of accidents on the county roads. A truck overturned with no discernible cause, a mysteriously collapsed bridge that cut off the northern route, isolating parts of the county further. Sheriff Peterson, usually so jovial and dismissive, was seen driving around town, his face grim, his usual easy smile replaced by a worried frown. He stopped at Earl's gas station one afternoon, filling his cruiser. Earl, who was there collecting a few precious gallons in a jerry, for his generator caught his eye. Peterson nodded, a short, stiff movement. "Earl," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "Things are not right. Folks are getting spooked." He didn't mention Earl's earlier warnings, but his gaze for the first time held a flicker of something, akin to fear, and perhaps a dawning realization. The sheriff might finally be starting to believe, but it was too late for a town meeting. Panic was already spreading, quiet and insidious. The full moon was coming. Earl felt it in his bones, a profound pull in the very air, an undeniable shift in the rhythm of the world. It wasn't just the lunar cycle, it was a signal, a call. The journal spoke of the full moon as a time of immense power for the Watchers, when the veil between worlds thinned, when their strength was at its peak. The night Earl had killed the skinwalker was, in grim irony, also a full moon. He had stumbled into their sacred time, their moment of power, and unleashed a rage that had simmered for decades. He had to prepare. Every instinct honed by years, in combat, by years of solitary survival, clicked into place. His mind, though weary, sharpened. He pulled out old maps of his property, tracing lines, identifying choke points, potential hiding spots, escape routes. He set simple, brutal traps around the perimeter of his house. Tripwires attached to hanging bells sharpened, stakes hidden under piles of leaves, anything to buy himself a few precious seconds. His arsenal was limited, but he cleaned and re-cleaned his Winchester and .357, their cold steel a familiar comfort against the rising tide of dread. He found an old box of buckshot, a few silver slugs he'd kept for deer hunting, and loaded them, a grim superstition whispering in his mind. The journal had spoken of iron and silver as deterrents, of ancient protective symbols. He roughly sketched the overlapping triangles onto scraps of wood and nailed them above his doors and windows, a desperate, last-ditch effort to ward off whatever unspeakable evil was coming. He wasn't a superstitious man, but desperation made a believer out of anyone. The moon, a sliver of white in the afternoon sky, began its slow, inexorable climb. The wind picked up, a mournful wail through the cornfields, carrying with it that acrid metallic smell, stronger now, almost suffocating. The cattle in the barn huddled together, their low moans a continuous, terrified chorus. Even the sturdy, old ranch house seemed to creak and groan more than usual, as if bracing for the coming storm. He made himself a last meal, stale bread and a can of beans, eaten cold. Every bite tasted like ash. He poured a final, strong cup of coffee and stood on his porch, watching the horizon. The sun was dipping, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and blood red. It was a fitting backdrop. As the last sliver of the sun vanished, the world plunged into a deep, bruised twilight. The temperature dropped sharply. The wind howled a mournful, hungry cry. And then, slowly, majestically, the moon began to rise. It was full, and not just white. Tonight, bathed in the dying light of the sunset, it appeared to glow with an eerie, terrifying crimson, a blood moon. It cast a lurid, unsettling red glow over the fields, transforming the golden wheat into a sea of swaying, blood-stained stalks. Earl, Winchester gripped tight, his .357 at his hip, stood his ground. He knew what was coming. This wasn't just a beast. It was something ancient, something that owned this land, something he had foolishly, tragically awakened. He heard the whispers louder now, a frantic symphony of dry hisses and ragged, distorted mimicry. Earl, hollow, hungry. They came from all directions, from the dense woods, from the swaying cornfields, from the very air around him. And then he saw them. Not one pair, not two. From the deepest shadows of the corn, from the darkest edges of the tree line, multiple pairs of amber eyes ignited. Like embers in the darkness, they flickered into existence, a chilling constellation of malevolence. They weren't just watching him. They were surrounding him. A pack. More than he had ever anticipated. And they were closing in. The silence, once oppressive, now thrummed with the barely contained anticipation of countless unseen horrors. The Red Hollow was no longer just his home. It was a hunting ground. And tonight, under the horrifying glow of the blood moon, Earl Whitaker was no longer just the hunter. He was the bait. And the trap was sprung. The world bled red. The blood moon, a monstrous eye in the sky, cast its lurid glow across the fields of wheat, turning them into a vast whispering sea of crimson. It was a hellish tableau, and Earl Whitaker stood at its grim center, the Winchester feeling impossibly heavy in his trembling hands. The amber eyes, dozens of them, flickered in the darkness that writhed beyond the range of his porch light. Surrounding his property, the whispers became a chorus, a dry, rasping cacophony of distorted sounds and half-formed words. Hunger, Earl, hollow, home. He wasn't fighting one beast. He was fighting a pack, and they weren't just animals. They were intelligent. The first attack came from the cornfield to his west, a ripple of movement too fast for human eyes to follow, too low to the ground to be a man. Then, a dark shape launched itself from the stalks, a blur of matted fur and sharpened claws. Earl didn't hesitate. He swung the Winchester, leading the target like he was back in the jungle, and fired. The shotgun blast ripped through the night, a thunderclap against the whispering chorus. The creature yelped, a sound of surprise and pain, stumbling back into the rustling corn. A faint, sickening thud followed, as if it had hit something hard. One of his improvised tripwires. He'd strung old canning jars with pebbles along lengths of fishing line, just high enough to catch an ankle. Crude, but effective. Another set of eyes flared, this time closer to the barn. Earl shifted his aim, scanning the perimeter. They were testing him, probing his defenses, learning his patterns. He could feel their chilling patience, their cold cunning. This wasn't a frenzied charge. It was a siege. He heard the scraping sound at the side of the house, near the old pantry. Window he'd boarded up. Not a crash, but a deliberate probing. Scratch like something massive and clawed was trying to find a weak point. He sprinted inside, swinging the shotgun up. The boards groaned, splintering faintly under unseen pressure. He fired blindly into the wall, hoping the buckshot would deter whatever was there. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, frustrated growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The journal. Thomas Thorne's words echoed in his mind. Iron and silver. Deterrence. He had loaded some silver. Slugs. More out of a desperate hope than any real belief. He ripped open a box of shells, fumbling with shaking hands to eject the spent buckshot and replace it with the precious silver. He moved from window to window, a ghost in his own home, the beams of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive gloom, illuminating fleeting glimpses of movement outside. They were fast, terrifyingly so. Shapes would dart from the cornfield, disappear into the woods, only to reappear moments later on the other side of the house. They seemed to melt into the shadows, becoming one with the night. He caught sight of one, taller than the rest, its silhouette momentarily stark against the blood moon. Its body was lean, almost gaunt, but coiled with immense power. It moved with a disturbing grace, more human-like in its posture than the one he'd killed. This was not a mindless beast. This was a dark hunter. Then came the breach. A sickening crunch of wood splintering, followed by a guttural roar from the back door. Earl had braced it with the heavy workbench, but it had yielded. He heard the scrabbling of claws, the low growls. He knew he had minutes, maybe seconds, before they were inside. He cursed, bolting towards the door, shotgun ready. He fired through the thin wood, aiming for the sounds. A pained howl, then a heavy thud. He could hear something dragging itself away. But they were relentless. A new set of scrabbling noises began at the window near the fireplace, lower, more persistent. They were spreading out, trying to overwhelm him, to force him to choose which threat to address. He was bleeding. A glancing blow from a claw, a splinter from the door, a deep cut on his forearm where he'd fumbled with the shotgun. The adrenaline kept him going, a burning inferno in his gut, but fatigue was beginning to set in. Every movement was an effort, his muscles screaming. His vision blurred at the edges. He stumbled, knocking over a lamp. The house was plunged back into total darkness, save for the eerie red glow filtering through the boarded windows. This was their element. This was the Hollow's embrace. He heard a crash from the kitchen. They were in. Earl dropped to a crouch, his military training taking over. He moved silently through the familiar darkness of his home, guided by instinct and the guttural sounds of the creatures. He heard heavy breathing, the clatter of overturned pots. They were in his kitchen, his sanctuary. A hulking shadow moved past the archway leading into the living room. Earl brought the Winchester up, fired. The buckshot tore through the shadow. A scream, more human than animal, echoed through the house, followed by a crash as the creature went down. He heard heavy footsteps dragging, then the sickening sound of something being torn. They were feeding, on their own, or on something else. He didn't want to think about it. He needed to get outside. The house was compromised. It was no longer a fortress, but a trap. He burst through the front door, shoving aside the broken latch. The night air hit him like a physical blow. The blood moon still hung in the sky, a malevolent eye illuminating the carnage. There were more of them than he thought, at least half a dozen. One was hunched over the remains of the one he'd just shot in the kitchen, its snout buried in the carcass, ripping and tearing. Others were circling, their amber eyes gleaming in the moonlight. One of them, the largest he had seen so far, detached itself from the pack. This one was different, taller, broader, its fur darker, almost black, and matted with what looked like dried blood. Its eyes weren't just amber. They burned with an unsettling, intelligent malice. It moved with a predatory grace that spoke of immense power and chilling cunning. This was the leader, the general. It let out a low growl, but it wasn't the frantic sound of the others. This was a command. The other skinwalkers paused their gruesome meal, their heads snapping up, their amber eyes fixed on their leader, then on Earl. They were waiting for orders. Earl raised the Winchester, aiming for the creature's chest. He squeezed the trigger. Click. Empty. He'd exhausted his shotgun rounds. The leader let out a mocking, guttural chuff, a sound of dark amusement. It advanced, slowly, deliberately, its massive claws scraping against the packed earth. Earl dropped the empty Winchester and drew his .357 Magnum, the cold steel a small comfort. He had 5 rounds left, 5 precious chances. He'd loaded 2 with silver, 3 with regular hollow points. He just prayed the silver would work. "Come on, you bastard," Earl spat, his voice hoarse, raw with exhaustion and a desperate resolve. The skinwalker lunged, impossibly fast. Earl fired, the .357 roaring, the flash momentarily blinding him. The silver round struck the creature square in the chest. It howled, a sound of pure agony, but it didn't stop. It kept coming, its speed undiminished. The journal was right about the silver being a deterrent, but not a kill switch. Earl dodged, twisting to the side, feeling the wind of its claws as it swiped past him, tearing a gash in his shirt. He fired again, a regular round this time, aiming for its leg. The creature staggered, a low growl escaping its throat, but its momentum carried it forward. It crashed into Earl, sending him sprawling to the ground, the .357 flying from his grip. The creature was on him in an instant, a crushing weight, its fetid breath hot on his face, its fangs inches from his throat. Its claws raked his side, ripping through his flesh, a searing pain blooming across his ribs. He cried out, not in surrender, but in a primal burst of defiance. He grabbed the creature's matted fur, pulling with all his might, desperate to create space. He kicked, thrashing, remembering a move from his old combat days. A desperate, brutal knee to the creature's groin. The skinwalker howled again, a deeper, more agonizing sound, and recoiled slightly, giving Earl a precious inch of space. He saw the 357 glinting faintly in the moonlight just beyond his reach. He lunged, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The creature recovered instantly, lunging back, its jaws snapping at his hand. Earl snatched the gun, rolled onto his back, and fired. The third shot, another silver round. It hit the creature squarely in the head. The monster stiffened, its massive body convulsing once, twice, then collapsed heavily onto Earl, its weight crushing the air from his lungs. Its yellow eyes, now glazed and lifeless, stared up at the blood moon. A final, vacant gaze. Earl pushed the dead weight off him, gasping, every muscle screaming in protest. He dragged himself to his feet, swaying. Blood was warm and sticky on his side, his arm. He looked at the fallen leader. Its immense form sprawled in the dirt, grotesque and still. He had done it. He had killed the leader. The other skinwalkers, sensing the defeat, paused, their amber eyes wide, uncertain. They shifted, whimpering, looking from their fallen leader to Earl, then back to the cornfields. The whispering chorus died, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. He thought for a fleeting, exhausted moment that it was over, that he had won. But then the air grew colder still, a profound chill that sank into his very bones, deeper than the October night. The blood moon seemed to swell, its crimson light intensifying, casting long, writhing shadows that seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. The other skinwalkers, who had been hesitant, now whimpered, not in fear of Earl, but in something akin to reverent dread. They turned their heads one by one, their amber eyes fixed on the deepest part of the cornfield, where the shadows were darkest, most impenetrable. And from those shadows, something emerged. It was impossibly large, dwarfing the creature Earl had just killed. Its form was less defined, almost shifting, as if the darkness itself had coalesced into a monstrous, hulking shape. Its body was cloaked in shadows, making it difficult to discern exact features, but its sheer scale was terrifying. It moved with a slow, deliberate majesty, each step heavy, purposeful, shaking the very ground beneath Earl's feet. And its eyes. They weren't amber. They were a molten, hateful red, burning like twin coals in the abyss of its face. They weren't just looking at Earl. They were boring into him, seeing every fear, every doubt, every sin. They were eyes that had seen centuries, millennia. It stopped at the edge of the field, its immense head tilted slightly, and then it spoke. Not a growl, not a whisper, not a mimicry. It was a voice that reverberated through the very air, a chorus of 1,000 tormented whispers, a sound like gravel grinding on bone, yet horrifyingly clear. Earl Whitaker. His name, spoken with an ancient, terrifying authority. Earl staggered back, his bloodied hand clutching the 357, his mind screaming in terror. This wasn't a beast. This was the Hollow itself, and it had finally come for its debt. The voice. It wasn't a growl, nor a mimicry. It was the whisper of countless voices, ancient and raw, scraping against each other like bone on stone, yet impossibly clear. Earl Whitaker. It resonated not just in his ears, but in his very bones, vibrating through his teeth, into the core of his being. He stumbled back, his bloodied hand clutching the 357, his mind screaming in terror. This wasn't a beast. This wasn't a pack. This was the Hollow itself, manifested. The other skinwalkers, the pack he'd been battling, whimpered, not in fear of Earl, but in a profound, guttural reverence for the colossal entity that had emerged. They shrank back, melting into the shadows of the cornfield, their amber eyes dimming, their forms becoming indistinct against the backdrop of the blood moon. They were lesser things, mere extensions, the physical manifestations of a far greater, more ancient power. The immense entity stepped fully into the lurid light of the blood moon. It was not flesh and blood as the others were. Its form was less defined, almost shifting, like solid darkness given shape. Nearly 10 feet tall, it seemed to be composed of writhing shadows and gnarled root-like tendrils that pulsed faintly. With the crimson light, its eyes, those molten, hateful red orbs, were twin infernos in the abyss of its face, burning with an intelligence that dwarfed anything Earl had ever encountered. It exuded an aura of profound age, of a power that had predated man and would outlast him. It raised one immense, shadowy hand, not quite clawed, but formed of the same shifting darkness, and pointed directly at Earl. The whisper chorus returned, now clear, chilling words echoing in his mind, directly in his thoughts, bypassing his ears entirely. You disturbed the sleep. You broke the binding. Earl swallowed, tasting blood and dust. What are you? He rasped, his voice a pathetic tremor against the entity's booming mental presence. The entity shifted, its form rippling like disturbed water. The chorus of whispers intensified, a cold dread seeping into Earl's mind. We are the root, the echo, the true guardians of this land, misunderstood, feared, bound, by those who built upon sacred ground, by the thorn blood. A jolt of ice shot through Earl. Thorn, the journal. Your ancestor, Elias, he came, he took, he built. He sought to silence us, to chain us. He drew the symbols, he bound us with blood, his own, and the blood of the land. The images flooded Earl's mind. A crude, ancient ritual. A desperate man carving the very symbol from the journal into the earth, pouring blood into it, trying to contain a power he barely understood. His son, Thomas, the one who knew. He tried to finish it, to make the peace, to rebind what his father broke, but he failed. He disturbed the lesser guardian. He freed the first, the weakest of our kin. He was sacrificed to quiet the fear. Earl's mind reeled. The skinwalker. He'd killed. It wasn't just a monster. It was a lesser guardian, part of a twisted, ancient defense system set up by Thorn, designed to protect the land, but corrupted by the very act of binding. And Earl, by killing it, had not ended the threat. He had severed the last, frayed thread of the old binding. He had not only broken it, he had destroyed its very foundation. Your hand. Earl Whitaker, your act. You ended the binding, you freed us. Now, the debt must be paid. The Hollow You demands its due. What debt? Earl demanded, fear giving way to a desperate anger. I defended myself. I didn't know. The entity rippled, and a new image flashed into Earl's mind. His land thriving, then slowly, subtly decaying. The livestock dying with precise cuts. The whispers, the fires. All not random acts of terror, but subtle, escalating demands. Warnings the Hollow was waking, asserting its claim. The land remembers. The old ways. They are not forgotten. For centuries our rage was held by the binding. The lesser ones kept the balance. Now, there is no balance, only hunger. It extended its shadowy hand fully, pointing towards the place where he'd buried the first skinwalker. You killed the sentinel. You unleashed the root. There is only one way to rebind the Hollow. To pay the debt. You must become the new guardian, the keeper of the silence. You will be the binding, the sacrifice. Earl felt a cold wave of understanding, a horrifying clarity. This wasn't about his death. It was about his life, and what it would become. He would be bound, like the creature he had killed, forever tied to the land, forever watching, forever becoming. The next skinwalker, the next sentinel, would be him. No, Earl whispered, his voice cracking, but his resolve hardening. I won't. The entity took a slow, deliberate step forward, its immense form dwarfing Earl, casting him in its abyssal shadow. The air grew impossibly cold, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar in his mind, threatening to shatter his sanity. Resistance is futile. The debt must be paid, or the Hollow will consume all your farm, this county. Every soul that breathes upon our earth. He knew it was true. He felt the immense power emanating from the creature, a force that could unravel reality. He thought of Sarah, of his father, of the peace they had known on this land. He thought of the town, of Mrs. Albright, of Sheriff Peterson, blind and helpless. He had one bullet left, the last silver round in his .357. He knew it wouldn't kill this thing. It wasn't flesh and blood. But the journal had said iron and silver were deterrents for binding, not for killing. A desperate, wild plan sparked in his mind, born of military strategy and the old lore. He remembered Thomas Thorne's last frantic words: the ritual was incomplete. There is a way to stop it, but it requires a sacrifice, is a true one. And the symbol must be carved, it must be seen. He had carved the symbol on the dead skinwalker's chest, unknowingly. But he was not the ritual. The land was. The debt. Do you want your debt? Earl snarled, his eyes blazing with a defiant fury. You can have it. He raised the .357, not aiming for the shadowy form, but for the ground at his feet, directly beneath him. He was standing on the very soil, the heart of his farm, the land inherited from his father, the place where he had fought and bled, the ground that was now saturated with his own sacrifice. He pulled the trigger. The .357 roared, the silver slug digging deep into the earth. The entity recoiled with a terrifying, piercing shriek, not of pain, but of outrage, a sound that split the night. The ground beneath Earl vibrated violently, a deep tremor running through the land. The blood moon above flickered, its crimson light wavering. The shadowy tendrils of the creature writhed, contracting, as if in immense agony. Fool, what have you done? The chorus of whispers screamed in his mind, now laced with fury and something akin to fear. Earl fell to his knees, his body racked with pain, his vision blurring. He had shot his own land, with silver, a sacrifice. Not his life, but his allegiance, his choice. The land now bonded to him, not by inheritance but by blood and silver. And the curse. The entity shrieked again, a sound of profound frustration and impotent rage. It began to recede, dissolving back into the darkest shadows of the cornfield. Its molten red eyes shrinking, dimming. It didn't vanish completely, it merely became less substantial, a chilling, lingering presence, a malevolent shadow on the edge of perception. The chorus of whispers faded, replaced by the crushing silence, now heavier, more knowing than ever before. The blood moon, still full, slowly began to lose its crimson hue, reverting to its usual stark white, cold, and indifferent. The other, skinwalkers, the lesser ones, were gone, melted away with their master. Earl lay there, sprawled on the damp earth, bleeding, shivering, his body utterly spent. He had survived, but Red Hollow was irrevocably changed, and so was he. He didn't know how he did it, but he dragged himself back into his house. The sun was rising, casting long, accusing fingers of light across the ruined kitchen. He stanched his wounds, bandaged them clumsily. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands shaking so violently the mug rattled against the saucer. Red Hollow returned to its quiet. The livestock stopped acting agitated. The inexplicable accidents ceased. The sheriff, though still wary, eventually reverted to his old, dismissive self. The people forgot the brief, unsettling panic, dismissing it as communal delusion, a bad batch of moonshine, or perhaps as Earl's wild tales. They settled back into their blissful, ignorant peace. But Earl Whitaker knew the truth. He never left Red Hollow again. He repaired his farm, tended his cattle, but he was no longer the same man. His eyes, once shrewd and observant, now held a deep, ancient weariness. He walked his land every day, not just checking fences, but listening to the profound silence that now permeated everything. A silence he understood was not an absence, but a presence, a vigilance. He felt the hollow. He felt its pulses, its demands, its quiet hunger. He was bound to it. His shot, that final act of defiance and desperate sacrifice, had bound him to the land, to the root, becoming its unlikely, unwilling guardian. He understood now that the creature he killed hadn't been the enemy. It had been a part of the binding, a grotesque form of balance, and by killing it, he had taken its place. Sometimes, late at night, when the moon was full, Earl would walk to the edge of his cornfield, to the place where the shadowy entity had emerged. He wouldn't see the amber eyes anymore, but he would feel it, a cold, immense presence just beyond his sight, and sometimes, carried on the faintest breath of wind, he would hear it, a single, distinct whisper, not of 1,000 voices, but of one, deep and resonant. You are ours, now. He knew the peace was a lie, a temporary reprieve. The Hollow had been paid its due for now, but debts in Red Hollow were never truly settled. They merely accumulated. And Earl Whitaker, the weary veteran, the reluctant guardian, knew that he would spend the rest of his days waiting for the next payment, waiting for the silence to hum too loud, waiting for the Hollow to claim its next inevitable due. And a part of him, a cold, dark part, wondered if, when that day came, he would be the one to pay it, or the one to demand it. The skinwalker's eyes, almost human, still stared at him from his nightmares. And sometimes, when he looked into the mirror, he could swear his own eyes held a flicker of something ancient, something amber, something that was no longer entirely his own. The Red Hollow had claimed its debt, and the price was eternal vigilance.